The moment I opened my eyes, the sterile white ceiling of the hospital room greeted me. My name is Shadow Lurker 87, though most people just call me Shadow. I'm 28 years old, living a life that always felt like an afterthought to my parents. I never thought my life would come to this, lying in a hospital bed, waiting for someone who would never show up. The beeping of machines, the scent of antiseptic, the dull ache that throbbed through my body. Everything reminded me of the accident. A car had run a red light, slamming into the side of my vehicle. The impact had left me unconscious, with a fractured rib, a concussion, and bruises that painted my skin in shades of purple and blue. I had been in the hospital for a week, and my parents hadn't called. Not once. At first, I told myself there must have been a mistake. Maybe they didn't get the message. But no, the doctors had informed them the night of the accident. My parents were listed as my emergency contacts. 4 days passed, and my phone remained silent. I kept glancing at the screen, expecting something. A call, a text, any sign that they cared. Nothing. On the 5th day, my phone buzzed. Relief surged through me as I grabbed it, only for my stomach to drop when I read the message. Don't forget to transfer your part of the mortgage this month. That was it. No, are you okay? No, we heard about the accident. Just a reminder about money. I stared at the screen, my fingers tightening around the device. My hands trembled, whether from anger or disappointment. I wasn't sure. They didn't visit until a week after the accident, but they weren't there for me. My brother had been arrested. I should have been used to it by now. He had always been their priority. I was just the background noise in their perfectly curated life, an afterthought to the golden child they paraded around. But sitting in that hospital bed, still aching from the accident, I realized something that had been gnawing at me for years but never fully surfaced. I wasn't really their child. I was just an obligation. When they entered my room, I saw no concern in their eyes, no guilt for their absence. My father crossed his arms. My mother sighed as if she were inconvenienced. They sat down, but the conversation wasn't about me. It was about my brother, his future, and what a tragedy it was that he had been arrested. I couldn't hold it in anymore. I was in a car accident, I said, my voice sharper than I intended. I could have died, and you didn't even call. My mother waved a hand dismissively. You're fine now, aren't you? My father shook his head. We couldn't waste time. Your brother was receiving an award that night. We had to be there. I laughed, a bitter, hollow sound. An award? That was more important than your own child in the hospital? You don't understand, my mother said, as if I were a stubborn child refusing to listen. Your brother brings honor to this family. What would people think if we missed his big moment? I felt something inside me crack, not just from their words, but from the certainty that nothing I said would ever matter to them. They had made their choice a long time ago, and I had never been part of it. And now, after a week of ignoring my existence, they were here. Not because they suddenly cared, but because they needed something. My brother had been arrested for fraud and embezzlement. The company he worked for had pressed charges, and bail had been set at a staggering amount. My parents had already drained most of their savings on lawyers. Now, they wanted me to cover the rest. Your brother needs you, my father said, as if that was all the reason I needed. This is your chance to prove you're part of this family. I stared at them, waiting for the punchline. You ignored me for a week. You didn't care if I lived or died, and now you expect me to bail him out? My mother's eyes flashed with irritation. Don't be selfish. We're family. You have a good job. You can afford it. I could feel my heartbeat in my ears. I took a slow breath, steadying myself. No! The silence was deafening. My father's jaw clenched. My mother's lips pressed into a thin line. They looked at me as if I had betrayed them, as if I were the one who had done something unforgivable. I hope you realize what you're doing, my father said coldly. Turning your back on your own blood. I smiled, though there was no warmth in it. That's funny, because that's exactly what you did to me. What would you have done in my place? Have you ever had to walk away from family? Let me know in the comments, and don't forget to stay tuned for the next part of my story. The moment they asked me for money, I knew there was nothing left to salvage. My brother had been charged with fraud and embezzlement. He had misused corporate funds, and now the company was pressing charges. My parents had already spent most of their savings on lawyers, hoping to make this problem disappear. And when that wasn't enough, they turned to me. "We need you to help your brother," my father said, his tone making it sound less like a request and more like a command. "This is your chance to prove you're part of the family." A week ago, they hadn't even checked if I was alive. Now they wanted me to prove my loyalty? The hypocrisy was staggering. I let out a short, humorless laugh. "No!" My mother's eyes narrowed. "You have a good job. You can afford this. Your brother—" "My brother did this to himself," I interrupted. "And you're enabling him." The disgust on their faces was instant, as if I had personally insulted them. "After everything we've done for you," my mother seethed, "this is how you repay us?" Everything they'd done for me, the neglect, the favoritism, the constant reminder that I was never good enough. If this was their version of family, I wanted no part of it. I expected them to twist the story, and they did. Word spread quickly through our extended family, and at first, I braced myself for the inevitable backlash. I had refused to help my own brother. I had turned my back on my parents. But something unexpected happened. Distant relatives started reaching out, not to berate me, but to tell me the truth. One cousin revealed that my brother had borrowed money from their parents and never paid it back. When they finally confronted him, my parents cut ties with them completely. Another uncle told me about an accident my brother had caused. Instead of taking responsibility, he had blamed a parking attendant, and my parents had paid off the witnesses. And there was more. A former business partner of my brother, also a family member, explained how my parents had sabotaged their deal because they didn't think he was prestigious enough to be associated with our family name. I had always known my parents favored my brother, but I hadn't realized the full extent of the damage they had done to others for his sake. They had covered for him, protected him, destroyed relationships to shield him from consequences. And now they expected me to do the same. I refused to be part of their cycle of deception. For the first time in my life, I felt like I was seeing everything clearly. My parents had never truly cared about me, only about what I could provide. And if I refused to comply, I was disposable to them. So I made my choice. I blocked their numbers, removed them from my accounts, and cut them off completely. The weight I had been carrying for years, the constant struggle for their approval, the need to be seen, was gone. And in its place, I found something unexpected. The relatives my parents had alienated, they welcomed me with open arms. They understood. They had been through it too. For the first time, I felt like I belonged, not to the family I was born into, but to the one I chose. Have you ever had to make a difficult choice between loyalty and self-respect? I'd love to hear your thoughts. Share your experiences in the comments, and stay tuned for the next chapter of my journey. The more I looked into my brother's case, the clearer it became that he wasn't as innocent as my parents insisted. He wasn't the mastermind, that much was true, but he had known exactly what he was doing. The fraud had been orchestrated by executives higher up, but my brother had participated willingly, convinced that he was untouchable. I read through reports, talked to people who had worked with him, and the pattern became impossible to ignore. He had funneled company funds into fake projects, manipulated financial records, and spent money that wasn't his without a second thought. My parents refused to acknowledge any of it. To them, he was still the golden child, the victim of some cruel conspiracy. When I confronted them with the facts, my father scoffed. "So what if he made mistakes? He's family. You don't turn your back on family." I had heard that line too many times. "You're not asking me to stand by him. You're asking me to excuse everything he's done, just like you always have." My mother shook her head. "You're being dramatic. They're making an example out of him. If you don't help him now, what kind of person does that make you?" "It makes me someone who refuses to clean up his messes anymore." I could see it in their faces. the disappointment, the anger, but there was something else too. Fear. Not fear for my brother, but fear that they had lost control over me. For years, they had dictated what I should do, who I should be, how I should serve the family. They had never considered that I might walk away. And that's exactly what I did. In the end, my brother took a plea deal. He agreed to cooperate with the authorities and received a reduced sentence, 1 year in prison and community service. My parents were outraged, blaming the system, his coworkers, anyone but him. Even after everything, they still expected me to step in, to use whatever influence I had to make things easier for him. I ignored them. The day my brother was sentenced was the last time I spoke to my parents. At first, it felt like cutting off a limb. There was guilt, doubt, moments where I questioned whether I had done the right thing. But then, something strange happened. I started to feel free. The relatives my parents had alienated, the ones I had barely known growing up, reached out to me. They welcomed me without judgment, without expectation. Some of them had been through the same thing, cast aside, pushed away because they didn't fit my parents' definition of family. For the first time, I felt like I belonged somewhere. Not to the family I was born into, but to the one I had chosen. Have you ever had to walk away from people who were supposed to love you? It's never easy, but sometimes it's the only way to find peace. Let me know your thoughts, and stay tuned for the next part of my journey. Cutting off my parents should have felt like an ending, but in reality, it was the beginning of something new. For the first time, I wasn't living under their expectations, their disappointments, their constant reminders that I was never enough. I was free, but freedom came with its own challenges. At first, the silence was deafening. No more calls, no more texts, no more passive-aggressive guilt trips about how I had failed the family. I had braced myself for some kind of retaliation, maybe a message from my father, dripping with anger, or one last attempt from my mother to make me feel small. But they had always been transactional, and without anything left to gain from me, they simply let me go. What I didn't expect was the overwhelming support from the relatives they had pushed away. My aunt, whom I had barely spoken to in years, invited me over for dinner. My cousin, who had always been distant at family gatherings, texted to say she understood. I had spent years believing I was alone, only to find that I had a family all along, just not the one I was born into. One night, as I sat in my apartment, scrolling through old messages I would never respond to, I realized something. I no longer felt like I had to prove myself. There was no invisible competition, no desperate attempt to earn approval that would never come. The weight I had carried my entire life was gone, and in its place was something unfamiliar but welcome: peace. My brother served his sentence, but my parents continued their narrative of his victimhood. I heard through extended family that they had cut ties with anyone who didn't agree with them. It didn't surprise me. They had spent their entire lives molding the truth to fit their version of reality, and if that version no longer included me, then so be it. I stopped waiting for closure that would never come. There would be no apology, no grand realization on their part. They would never admit they were wrong, and I no longer needed them to. The past would always be there, but it no longer defined me. Some people believe that family is everything, that blood ties are unbreakable. But I've learned that family isn't about genetics or obligation. It's about choice. It's about the people who stand by you, not because they have to, but because they want to. If you've ever had to walk away from family, I see you. I know how hard it is, but I also know this: you are not alone. Sometimes the family we find is better than the one we were given. And for the first time in my life, I know I made the right choice. Have you ever had to choose yourself over people who were supposed to love you? It's never easy, but sometimes it's necessary. Share your thoughts below, and don't miss the final part of my journey. It took time to fully accept my decision, but with each passing day, I felt lighter. I no longer had to filter my thoughts, constantly worry about meeting impossible expectations, or brace myself for the next guilt trip. Cutting ties with my parents wasn't just about escaping their control. It was about reclaiming my life. For the first time in years, I allowed myself to make choices without the lingering fear of disappointing them. I took a spontaneous road trip, something I would have never done before. I signed up for a writing class, rediscovering a passion I had long buried beneath their judgment. I started opening up to people who genuinely cared about me, people who didn't see me as an extension of their ambitions, but as a person with my own worth. My parents never reached out again. I had half expected one final plea, a dramatic attempt to pull me back into their web, but it never came. Instead, they doubled down on their narrative, painting me as the selfish child who abandoned them, the ungrateful one who turned against family. I heard through distant relatives that they rarely spoke of me anymore. It was as if I had never existed. And strangely, that was okay. Letting go meant accepting that I would never get the closure I once craved. There would be no apology, no acknowledgement of their mistakes. My parents would always see themselves as the victims, but that no longer mattered. I wasn't living for their approval anymore. My brother, after serving his sentence, attempted to contact me. His message was short. No apology, no recognition of the damage he had caused, just a casual reach out as if nothing had happened. I didn't respond. Maybe he had changed, maybe he hadn't. Either way, it wasn't my responsibility to find out. What I had now was peace, real, quiet, undisturbed peace. I had spent so much of my life trying to earn a place in a family that never truly accepted me, only to realize I didn't need their validation to be whole. Life moves forward, and so do I. Have you ever had to step away from a toxic relationship, even if it meant letting go of people who were supposed to be family? I'd love to hear your thoughts. Let's talk in the comments, and thank you for being part of this journey with me.